I've just got back from the new Mummy movie, the movie that's supposed to kick off Universal's Dark Universe series of films. So is this a brave new world of gods and monsters, or just another way for Universal to fail to realise the potential of the stable of classic monsters that they've got at their disposal? Since their heyday in the 30s, with films that made megastars out of the likes of Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, Universal have been desperately trying to find ways of utilising their classic stable of monsters. In 1999, Stephen Sommers seemed to find a really successful seam of family-friendly action, adventure and human to resurrect the Mummy to great success and multiple sequels. But given the keys to the kingdom and the rest of the monsters stumbled, in my opinion, badly with Van Helsing, and Universal have been stumbling ever since, not really sure what to do. The schizophrenic nature of Benicio del Toro's The Wolfman, because of radical reshoots, a movie which I love, by the way, left them floundering for years after that, not knowing what to do. Dracula Untold getting made amidst the plans to start a new universe and reshoots tying it in, then the movie not doing very well because it's not very good, causing it to be the red-headed stepchild and then officially written out of canon. Universal are trying again, and they're trying big with Tom Cruise and The Mummy. And do they succeed? Well, kinda, sorta. I was completely on board with this movie whilst I was watching it. In fact, about half an hour in, I turned to my girlfriend and said, "This is really good." And I was really enjoying it. But between the end credits rolling and getting home, I'm starting to feel a little more hollow. Certainly for those of us who are steeped in horror movie history. It's a strange watch because you could almost have a mental bingo card in your head and tick off bits of this movie that remind you of other movies and other types of movies. Certainly the newly resurrected Ammonets, all corpse-like and shrunken and moving insect-like, reminded me of plenty of J-horror, specifically Ringu and the Ju-on movies. Later on, as she's sucking the energy, well, the life force out of people and turning them into her zombie slaves, there's a whole ton of Tobe Hooper's life force going on in the movie. There's a big, awkward wedge of American Werewolf in London, where if you're gonna have your dead friend come back and look all rotten and start talking to you and no one else can see him, everyone is going to be thinking of American Werewolf in London. And it's never a good idea to have your audience thinking of a better movie whilst your movie is playing. There were times I got a weird Brian Lumley's Necroscope vibe. I don't know how many of you have read Brian Lumley's Necroscope books. They're fucking phenomenal, by the way, and they're crying out to be made into a movie. And there are elements of this movie that made me see what a Necroscope movie could be. There's a certain, when they get to England, there's a certain chunk of this movie, a goodly chunk, that for me had the vibe of a James Herbert novel, which is no bad thing. Specifically The Survivor, because we know from the trailers that Tom Cruise survives the plane crash, and that's what The Survivor is all about. But the sort of selfish bastard hero who goes from set piece to set piece against an evil opponent has more than the smack of James Herbert about it. And I'm particularly a fan of James Herbert. I love his stuff, so that wasn't an issue with me. But I guess the hollowness I referenced earlier is because whilst the film is put together well and whilst it's running before your eyes, you can enjoy it, and I did enjoy it. It's got no soul of its own, if that makes sense. For all that Boris Karloff's 1932 Mummy is to modernise a very slow and languorous affair, and some people love that pace and that languor and that sort of mesmerism that the film holds over you. Some people find it boring as hell. That film had a soul, Hammer's 1959 The Mummy had a soul to it. It had a vim. It had an energy to it. Heck, the 1999 Stephen Sommers film with Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz is all soul, it's all heart. This seems more like a film made out of set pieces, maybe made by committee. There doesn't feel to me to be an artistic drive behind telling this story other than potentially to set up other stories. The film, for that reason, doesn't ring true. Where this especially weakens the film is at the very end, where Tom Cruise's character has to choose between Amonette and his human partner. He has to choose whether to be good or evil, and the good side of him wins out, even though we've never seen him be good, and he does it because of her. And you never buy into their relationship, which is presented right at the front of the film as an opportunistic one-night stand. There's never any sense that there's a real connection between those two, and I just don't buy any of that stuff. That said, for a film that's a load of bits put together, there are bits in it that I really like. I love the opening and the discovery of the tomb. I love the flashback stuff. The plane crash, which is front and center in the trailer, is an excellent sequence. This isn't Mummy Impossible, but there are times when it feels like it's becoming Mummy Impossible. Right, we're going to have the next little action bit. It's not always built around the action bits, but there is a tension in the film between, is this a Tom Cruise movie, or is this a Universal monster movie? Is this a Mummy movie? And sometimes that tension becomes awkward. Sometimes when it gels together perfectly. The underwater sequence, an extended underwater sequence, is classic Tom Cruise territory. And don't get me wrong, I really like Tom Cruise movies. Him in an extended underwater sequence is bread and butter for Tom Cruise. Him in a sunken underground cathedral whilst he's underwater, with tombs opening and reanimated medieval crusaders coming out of the tombs and swimming after him, in a sequence that will remind you a little bit of the underwater sequence in Alien Resurrection. That's an example of where the Tom Cruisiness and the mummy-ness of these two opposing forces actually combine to make a really great sequence, one that I enjoyed immensely. There's tons of reanimated corpses in this, a sort of mummy zombie army. Kind of nothing happens with them. Amonette seems to have control over creatures, wildlife, and other than using the swarm of crows to bring the plane down, nothing much else is really done with that, except for an excellent scene where she controls one tiny little spider. And it's in those smaller moments, if they could have resisted the urge to go big and pulled it back to these smaller moments of creepiness, like when Amonette appears in the sunken underwater chamber with them, like when she appears with the emergency services finding her sarcophagus after the plane goes down. These smaller moments work really well, and it makes me wish that it didn't have to be this big, huge, actiony thing to try and kick off a whole universe. But of course they're not trying to tell a small, focused, character-driven, creepy mummy story. They're trying to set up a dark universe. So we have to leave Iraq and go back to London, and beneath the Natural History Museum we have to meet Russell Crowe's Dr. Jekyll, the head of Prodigium. Sorry, I had to write it down, otherwise I was going to say perineum. Prodigium, this movie universe's version of S.H.I.E.L.D., basically studying and guarding the world against evils. Russell Crowe's having a high old time, he loves it. I actually loved him turning into into Mr. Hyde as well. It gets a little hokey when he gives Mr. Hyde a Cockney accent. But Russell Crowe and accents have never been the best of bedfellows. There are a couple of little Easter eggs. There's a Gillman claw in a formaldehyde container deep in the bowels of Prodigium, hoping that's not the one and only Gillman, because I'm really hoping that if this is successful and does spawn more movies, that someone is going to have a stab at Creature from the Black Lagoon. I'm far more eager to see a Creature from the Black Lagoon than I am an Invisible Man with Johnny Depp. That fills me with nothing but absolute malaise, the prospect of that film. As well as Gillman's claw, there is a nice little shot of the Book of Amun-Ra falling to the floor from the bookshelf in Prodigium. The Book of Amun-Ra from the 1999 Brendan Fraser movie, The Book of the Dead. It's on screen for a couple of seconds and then forgotten about. It was a nice wink and a nice nod in a film where comedy lies uneasily with action and a sense of dread that they may be trying to get across. I think ultimately there's just lots of different ingredients that sit uneasily next to one another. And it always feels like the film's got one eye a little further down the track on what we hope to do next, rather than really focusing all their attentions on this film. There is enough creepy stuff in this. There's much more than I thought there would be. There's much more horror elements in this than I at all thought there would be, based on the advertising campaign. They need to trust those instincts and go in that direction. More of that, less crashy planes. Hopefully the through line is creepiness and horror elements, and maybe each film will have a bit of a different vibe. So not a complete stumble to begin with, but maybe a slight misstep.